All right. We know Jennifer went to warm up her coffee, but let's get started because from 2:10, we had 45 minutes, and I think Chris and I could probably talk about this topic for 45 weeks. So,
Actually.
We have. So our topic today is assessment and feedback as a means to drive meaningful learning. So we're going to talk about three core elements today. We're going to talk about what feedback looks like in the classroom, how it can be utilized and partnered as a means of formative assessment, and how all of that translates to communicating progress, which of course we refer to as grades. So let's tell you who we are. I'm Chuck Sipe. I'm the assistant superintendent in Roxbury Public Schools. That's up in Morris County. I actually got my undergraduate degree from TCNJ. I got my master's degree in educational administration from Montclair State and my doctorate in curriculum and instruction from the University of South Carolina.
All right. And I'm Christopher Segar. I am the Director of Research, Planning, and Evaluation in the Roxbury School District. I got my undergraduate from Penn State University. I have my doctorate from Rutgers.
All right. So let's dive right in. Like I said, so we have lots of stuff to share. At the very end, you're going to get a QR code for a folder with a variety of resources. On this screen, as well as the last screen, are our emails. So if we say something that intrigues you, if we don't get to answer a question, if you have further follow-up, you can absolutely reach out to either of us anytime on this or anything for that matter.
Okay, so we're talking a little bit about the overarching rationale for the presentation, why we picked it. So when we think about the idea of assessment and feedback, which is kind of how we create a bridge between where the learner is and where we'd like the learner to be. So I think in a lot of cases, when we think about how educators or young teachers perceive the idea of assessment, they're thinking of creating benchmarks or like with the sanctity of the curriculum or what needs to be known. And the idea here, when we think about feedback, is to think about it as creating a bridge. The idea is you meet the learner where they are and you construct the bridge towards the knowledge and attainment there. And the way that you understand how to do that is through feedback. So when we look at this, feedback is by far and away through research most impactful through multiple sources. So in other words, the feedback that one gets should be direct. It should be attainable. In other words, a student who gains feedback, that feedback should be working on a specific thing that they understand what they need to do to move forward. And that feedback should come from different types of sources, because different types of students are able to kind of better work through where they are and where they need to be through multiple different types of sources. So that is reflective feedback, feedback from oneself, feedback from the teacher, feedback from a rubric, and feedback from peers.
Yeah, and I think the quote at the top of the screen here is really critical. One of the things teachers never want to do, either intentionally or unintentionally, is teach students that they can't be good at school, that school's not something that's for them, or that can't be exciting or fun. And oftentimes we inadvertently communicate that to students by not giving appropriate feedback or giving it in non-constructive ways. And so there's a ton of research out there that really describes what powerful feedback looks like. John Hattie talks a lot about that. One of the resources that's in the folder we'll share at the end is an article of his that's really kind of timeless. But the best way to really describe important feedback and powerful feedback is that it supports the student's opportunity to continue growing. When we treat feedback and assessment as the end of something, all right, this unit is over, we're done talking about this, you can no longer get better at this thing, we're sending students the wrong message. Certainly accountability is important, but using feedback in a very specific way to encourage students to not only take healthy risks in their learning, but also as an opportunity to drive the desire to grow is really the most important thing we can do for students. And, we picked a couple picture images here to support that, but if we use feedback as a means of teaching students mistakes are bad and something to be avoided, not only do we introduce a completely unnecessary aspect of stress into the school experience, but we do teach them that growth is unattainable and unrealistic. And when in fact, that's what the professional world really strives for is improvement.
I want to piggyback on that. So I think that is what solidifies that quote on the page prior, which is, as students move through schooling, learning becomes about loss and not about gain. Right. It's about protecting the grade. So the idea about catering and the creation of feedback, and we have resources in there to kind of help guide that, is to create specific tangible, short-term goals where a student can take ownership of their own learning. The idea here for feedback and good feedback creates a situation of what we call optimal challenge point or flow for a student, where a student feels like they're just out of reach of being able to attain something, but they know they can do it. Yeah. So instead of making learning about lost, you make it about small victories.
Well, and you know what, and the point on the bottom here can't be understated, you know, and so we need to really overstate this thing, which is teachers really need to model that expectation, right? They need to welcome feedback and they need to celebrate feedback as a part of their own growth. And too frequently that feedback only comes from a supervisor. So when you invite colleagues into your classroom to provide critical feedback, it's hard. It's hard to visit a colleague's classroom and not pat them on the back and support them because we're in this thing together. But doing so has the same impact it does on students, which is it can be actually counterproductive. So research tells us that feedback that is largely praise-oriented, you're so smart, you're so pretty, you're so good, right? Things that I'm a parent. I have a young son and a young daughter. And I make a point even as a parent to embody this sort of feedback strategy, which is feedback that's only praise-oriented is counterproductive in the long run, because when a student or an individual reaches that first hurdle or they reach that first struggle, it really challenges the self-image that they've built up. Like, wow, maybe I'm not really that smart. Maybe I'm not really that good. And so the 2 points on the bottom are: be specific with the feedback. I really like the way you this, or I really think you could continue to grow in this way. And teachers should celebrate that themselves in their practice, not only from a supervisory role of gathering feedback from their boss, their supervisor, the principal, get it from colleagues, get it from students. Why do we don't celebrate as educators the student's perspective of feedback enough? Because it breaks down the power imbalance. And so, you know, it's definitely something to consider as a part of developing a culture of feedback in a classroom. So good feedback takes careful planning, right? And Chris and I are going to kind of highlight a couple of these things as we all grow in our profession. And I don't just mean beginning novice teachers. I mean us. I've been in this business for over 20 years now. I still use feedback as a part of my growth process. I still try to plan what I'm going to do, what I'm going to say, how I'm going to approach it. But as we plan lessons, some of the most complicated elements are how we gather data from students, how we provide data back to them. And so formative assessment is one of the most powerful. And before I kind of pass this one back to Chris, somebody once gave a quote, and it's not mine, but it really resonated with me, which is formative assessment is the chef tasting the soup, right? They want to make sure that that thing is perfect before it goes out to the customer. Summative assessment is the customer tasting the soup, right? That's kind of the end game. It's hard to improve after that. So really planning that formative assessment and refining your product, refining your processes, gathering data, gathering all the information you can before getting to the conclusion is really kind of critical. And so there's some examples of how you can plan at the bottom.
So I'm gonna build on that a little bit here and talk about why good feedback is really difficult, because feedback in and of itself relies specifically on the learner, right? And it's impossible for a teacher to cut open a student's head and look at what their brain is doing, right? We can't see what their thought process is. So we have to find ways to make thinking visible. So good feedback planning in lessons is about creating obstacles, stopping points in the lesson for students to be able to visualize and to be able to communicate their thinking. And they may communicate that with a peer. They may communicate that on a piece of paper. They may communicate that through question and answer. But what you want to be able to do is create different types of models to make the thinking visible, so that as a teacher and as a student, both groups are able to see where they are excelling and where they might need help. And this is why you talk about things like exit tickets, which are kind of summatives at the end of a class, but still not the summative of a unit where you can come back, where you have specific types of dialogue routines. I'm a big fan of Harvard's Project Zero, which is visible thinking and creating cultures of thinking. I would suggest taking those books out and looking at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. They have thinking routines that encourage students, specifically, I would say 6th grade up, on how to communicate their thinking out loud. So as an educator, you can plan spots through games like What Made You Say That, or something called Chalk Talk, where kids have to draw their ideas or make headlines, where they get an understanding of how they can conceptualize and put down their thinking that allows an educator to be able to get an assessment of how everybody's doing fairly quickly. But more importantly, it encourages a situation where thinking about thinking is not just happening between the teacher and the student, it's happening between students and with the student themselves.
And that last point that Chris just made is a really complex element to introduce into a classroom, which is students dialoguing with one another about complex curriculum related ideas. And the way we were all educated, and I guess I'll just say for myself, was the teacher spoke, the student received. And breaking that construct down is really kind of complicated, and again, requires really intricate planning and detailed planning. So one of the suggestions here, Chris mentioned a couple, I have a question, who has the answer is a great way to engage students in student to student dialogue, right? Whereas we're learning something, students have questions. How do we encourage them to ask good questions and not be the one to answer them? Allow another student to answer. Allow yourself as the teacher to step back, become the facilitator of intellectual dialogue, and allow the kids to actually talk about what they're learning. One of the great ways we've begun to try and support that work in our own district is we've been using Eric Francis, who's a researcher on questioning techniques. He does a lot of work on DOK. He has a great book called Now That's a Good Question, who really talks about how to develop questions. There are some more advanced strategies to developing questions. Liz Santana has a great website called The Right Question Formulation Technique, and really talks about how to establish questions. But this again speaks to being vulnerable and practicing what you preach. How do we encourage students to be the ones to ask questions and then allow their classmates to be the ones to provide feedback and answers without being the one to step in and own it as the teacher?
Okay. So I'm just going to go through the kind of what makes an authentic assessment. And then we'll talk a little bit about we're going to take a step back in this. So I actually kind of want to give a guideline of kind of where we're going. So we talked a little bit about like how to put in feedback into the individual lessons for formative assessments. We talk a little bit about what makes a good assessment, what makes it student-centered. But then also after that, we're going to start to pull away from that towards grades, and then with something we're going to call transfer goals. So if you're educating teachers kind of look at it from the lesson plan and how to move into their grades. And then on a district level, you start to think about, well, what do our grades mean? And then how do we connect between different classes as we go up, right? Because, a second grade English class, first grade English class, ELA, 12th grade ELA kind of thing. There should be some congruence as we go up through the years of what's important. So as authentic assessments afford all students opportunities to demonstrate mastery. And what we mean by that is not just demonstrate the ability to go through a challenge of some sort, but to demonstrate mastery in the actual skill you want. And I think this becomes difficult when we're talking to teachers or young teachers who want to be able to assess students in the way that they were assessed or what they're familiar with. So the best way to do this is like if you're asking a kid to be able to demonstrate a really good argumentative thinking, but you make that student write that argument out. Now, if you're asking them to be able to demonstrate their ability to write an argument, that's one thing. Right. But if you want them to just be able to make a coherent argument, demonstrating mastery is not necessarily just putting it down on paper. So the idea here is that there should be some choice for a student to be able to demonstrate mastery in the standard strand, because what you're going to find is that otherwise a student is going to fail an assessment based on something you're not actually asking to assess them on.
For sure.
So diverse opportunities, once again, success for every student does not mean lower expectation. The idea here is to root in on the standard of what you actually want to assess and focus the assessment on that, which means choice never deviates from the standard, but will deviate in how a student is able to demonstrate that. A good resource for this is like there's a checkbox if you go to like Universal Design for Learning, which talks about multiple means of representation and multiple means of expression, which means that different parts of the brain for different students are going to be more compelled to specific ways of explaining their mastery of a skill. And this checkbox really helps teachers be able to plan the type of ways to assess them, so that allows students to be faithful to the standard, but also to be able to express their learning in different ways.
So there's two things here I want to just expand on. One is that willingness, that ability to evaluate students in a way that's really compatible with their learning and a strategy that allows them to effectively communicate what they learned is really critical. I mean, when I was in school, it was mostly focused on providing the teacher information the way they want me to provide it. And sometimes you can do that and sometimes you can't, which is not necessarily aligned with what you actually learned. And that definitely deviates from the traditional norm, which is here's the test, everyone take the test. Maybe some students are better at explaining it. Maybe some students are better making a video. That does require additional work on the teacher's part. It requires additional flexibility, but kind of brings us back to the whole purpose we created this presentation, which is what is the purpose? The purpose is to effectively encourage students that learning is fun and attainable and evaluate the progress they make while providing them structures for growth. So if that's really the goal, then being flexible with how we gather that information is important. I also want to encourage everyone to really consider very strongly what Chris said just a few moments ago about not lowering expectations when we try to meet the diverse needs of students. I feel like this is a really critical piece right now when the rhetoric, particularly in the media, is about how much students have lost due to the pandemic and the quarantining. Students haven't learned enough. Certainly, there have always been students who have struggled, and quite frankly, there always will be. There have always been students who are higher achieving. There always will be. But as we try to work to close gaps that may have been either exacerbated or created due to the quarantining, we certainly want to make sure we hold students to a high level of accountability. I think adding layers of flexibility in how we achieve those goals are really the key that will help us, if there is in fact a catch up that needs to be made, catch up to where those missing gaps are. And I think part of it is what is written on the slide here is providing students with very specific expectations for performance at the onset. I feel like too often as educators, it's like this unveiling at the very end, like, haha, this is the thing you were supposed to learn. Now, did you? Instead of sharing it on the front and saying, here are our goals, here's what I want you to learn, here's what I expect you to demonstrate. And I find that really intriguing because that is, in fact, what we do as educators, right? If a teacher's being evaluated in the classroom, well before any administrator ever comes in to evaluate progress, there's a rubric. Now, districts all have their own, their own tool that they use or that they've adopted, but everybody knows what it is in advance. It's really concerning that we don't provide students, our learners, with the same expectation.
Right. So let me just say, to sum that up a little bit, where I think there's a great point here is, at the end of the day, it's great if the teacher knows exactly where the student is and what the student needs to do. It's better when the student does. Right? Like it's the way it works.
Yeah, absolutely. There shouldn't be learning shouldn't be a mystery.
Right. So the best way then to kind of scope this out as an educator, and I think as teachers, it becomes overwhelming because you start to think about, okay, I'm going to assess every single one of these kids. So, and then I'm going to assess them in different ways that they want to be able to be assessed. And then I'm going to try to figure out different ways to communicate it to them. And then all of a sudden the brain shorts out because it's overwhelming. Like, right. Because it's like, I can't make a lesson plan for every kid. And that's not the point. Yeah. The point is to think about in this way, one, how will a kid demonstrate understanding of the standard strand? How do they demonstrate it? The strand, like what you want them to know, nothing else, just what you want to know. Then what you want to do is how will you know that that student understands it versus whether they can tell you back what you just told them. This builds your ability to be able to create the type of questions that you want to ask them. The idea here is this can then in turn give your students the ability to be able to design their own ways almost of being assessed, as long as they stay true to your way of saying, this is how you demonstrate understanding. This takes that mystery, that crazy overwork off the plate of the teacher and puts it on the student themselves in a lot of ways. A student being able to sit down and really think about from the beginning of that unit, how specifically does a student demonstrate understanding that informs the type of questions you're going to ask. It informs the type of assessments you're going to offer, and it informs the type of activities you want, because everything should be driving towards demonstrating understanding of those topics. Now, how does something like that look in practice? We'll talk a little, let me give an example because I was a social studies teacher forever. So I just go right back to history every single time. We don't all go back to like what we're familiar with, right?
So I'll go back to math. Everyone will be excited.
Everyone, right? Well, it gives you a good like polar ends of how to think about it. But if I had students, I had students, we were going to talk about different types of historical interpretations of something that happened, right? This little complex topic, we'll do high school, right? Which means like, okay, we all know the Cold War happens. We all know that there ends up being this tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, who were once allies, right? So I can have a kid memorize everything that's in the book and tell me exactly what happened, right? That's great. That's not understanding. At the beginning of the lesson, what I say to them, what I write down is, in order to develop it and demonstrate an understanding, a student has to be able to articulate in a way the nuances between the different ways of thinking about the start of the Cold War, which could be the Soviet Union, need for their ideological purity, and they wanted communism everywhere. The United States afraid of hitting a recession and trying to make sure everybody has a capitalist economy that's kind of wedded to the US. The fact that everybody is human and they're bumbling. And a kid being able to demonstrate understanding is the ability to be able to kind of weave through the nuances of that. And I always would put it in there. This is how you describe an understanding, that you understand that, yeah, there's a little bit of here, there's gray areas in between, and a kid can write that down. Some kids were, like these unbelievable writers. Mm-hmm. Some kids could put it into production. I had one grouping of kids who just like to write songs about stuff, and their ability to understand the nuances and play with words was amazing. And they were brilliant about it. But in each case, it had to be not just, I memorized this textbook, I gave it right back to you.
Well, and that's kind of why the show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader, is kind of funny. Because we evaluate we have gone through generations of evaluating students in this regurgitation style format where learning and knowledge don't become our own. And it's funny because people aren't, right? Like they don't remember that stuff because it's not the transcendent life knowledge that they really hang on to unless it's personally passionate for them. And so Chris's example of allowing students the spaces to maybe write songs or create a production to demonstrate their knowledge is a really creative way to utilize a tool that's on the screen, which is, how will you evaluate those indicators of understanding for students? What do they look like? And I know this sounds crazy, but maybe students could weigh in on this. Yeah. At the beginning of a unit, imagine this, sharing with students, here are the items I want you to understand. How do you think you will be able to communicate that understanding? And even crazier, maybe they modify it as they go. Maybe they suspected something about what their learning would look like, and it changed. It's crazy when that happens. Things change.
Okay, so we're moving into grading. So we start off with, what is feedback? Why is it important? How does it inform lesson planning? Then we kind of move towards, the idea of assessment and what a good assessment is and how we target that. And the final part, we get to the next part, which is like the big thing, the big report out, right? The thing that nobody likes, but everybody will murder you if you try to get rid of it, which are like the grading system. And I think it's really important, right? There's always this great thing that I can't remember which politician said, probably a million politicians said, which is like your budgets are your value, right? Where you put your money are your values. You can say anything you want. You can say you love all these different things, but if you don't put any money in it, if you don't put a budget into it, yeah, you don't value it, right? What we measure in education is what we value. We say all kinds of things about the things we care about, but if we're not going to measure it and we're not going to give feedback on it, then we don't really value it. Now we can say we value it, and maybe deep down inside we do. But if we do value it and we're not measuring it, right, in some way, then what we're doing is we're having a disconnect between our belief system and our practices. So what we wanted to do is kind of give you this screen here, and hopefully you have the opportunity to be able to do this, is if you have your cell phone, you can take a look at the QR code there for a brief reflection, which is, what are grades and what should they be? We already know that we give kids A's, B's, C's, or whatever it is, right? And then you got an argument with a parent one time about giving the value of an A in kindergarten.
What's an A in kindergarten math really? What's it mean?
What's it mean? But the question here is like, if you can jot this down whenever you want. And kind of in some ways, we kind of want people to kind of jot down just their thoughts as like a brain dump if they can. Because I think if you can reference it back of just kind of, what is the intended goal of communication of grades? How should we inform information to the parents, and how do we demonstrate an understanding? And a kid gets an 80. What does that mean to a kid? Like, what are we reporting out? How are we measuring this? And then in the other hand, like, what information should contribute to a grade, and how do we report that information? It might be great for us to report out a kid's ability to be a good citizen. The question is, should that be then rolled into their ability to do calculus, or should it stand out separate and be reported, but then also be celebrated in a different way?
Yeah, and this is one of the really sticky conversations in education right now, because nobody knows otherwise for the most part, right? Grading structures have been in place for as long as we were students. I'm confident in that. But the problem really lies in the fact that they were in place in the same structural fashion as they were for us, as they were for our parents, right? And so when you try to change the dynamic, it moves to this conversation of like, well, why should we change it? It worked for me, which in my opinion earns the response question, did it? Like, did it really work? Which is
right,
like,
which is like,
right.
Which is like the fall behind conversation.
Yeah.
The kids are falling behind. Falling behind what? I have no idea what you're talking about. Right.
So when you talk about, let's connect this presentation, how do you, in a moment's notice, provide information to students to encourage growth? What's that connected to? Eventually we need to communicate, right? Like, our community wants information, and that's the real point of grades, right? The purpose of grades is to communicate progress to a constituency made up of the students and the parents, right? All of differing interest levels on those, right? And so on, maybe it's the next slide or 2 slides from now, we refer to the data blender, because that's kind of how grades largely happen, right? We take a whole bunch of information, smush it together, and out kicks A, B, C, D, F. Our district has started to do some work with Thomas Guskey, and we're going to get into just a pinch of that about trying to really challenge the status quo on what grading means. And I think our district has made some really great strides elementary wise in terms of a mastery report. And so, sharing information with parents about progress that is connected to standards, that is not just translated down to some letter. And that's reasonably acceptable for a lot of parents, not only in our community, but in other communities. It really gets challenged and pushed back on as you get older, and particularly at the high school years, where we're really talking about changing the transcript, right? Which is largely offensive to lots of people. And the offense there connects not necessarily to the moral high ground as it pertains to communicating effectively about learning. Mm-hmm. It more connects to, you're going to screw up my kids' chances to get into Princeton because they want to see A's, although they can't necessarily describe what those A's mean. And they're not necessarily transferable from one classroom to the next, let alone one school to the next, one state to the next, or any of those things. And so when we started working with Dr. Guskey, we started asking some of these questions, which is, how do you memorialize growth and mastery? What does the long-term thinking look like in a discipline? And how does all of that come together to be effectively communicated? On top of the fact, and Chris kind of referred to this real quickly, and I'll pass it back to him, how do you separate what Guskey refers to as product from process? He also talks about progress markers, but to really kind of explain that real fast, process markers are kind of how we go about the learning. Things like effort, attitude, cooperation, homework, right? Versus the product, which are the markers towards achievement, the grades, so to speak, presentations, quizzes, tests, things like that. Because right now they go into the data blender, mm-hmm. We hit blend, and out kicks a letter. So how do you effectively communicate that stuff?
Mm-hmm. And every time you say Thomas Guskey, it's like, I get,
I know Chris is fanboying.
I do. It's really sad. We met him, and it was like meeting Paul McCartney. Like, I was trouble. I had trouble putting together words. All right. So now, some of the important parts here is this, and I think Chuck said something just a couple seconds ago, which make a lot of sense.
First time ever.
for some, this is how, we've been talking too long because we start making fun of each other. But there's, so parents see grades as basically an A,
Good.
and can be used to purchase the next level, right? So they see it as a transactional, basically a way of demonstrating value worth transaction, right? If an A is worth $100, a B is worth $80, right? And at the end, the amount of money I have purchases me the college I want to go to. And when I purchase the college I want to go to, I get to have a life that's better than everybody else's or whatever it is, right? So the idea here is, this is really difficult to do because we actually have a system that really reinforces this. So the question is not necessarily how do you change every parent's view about the way grades are going to be. If you're looking to do that and you can figure out a way to do that, please email me and tell me the secret formula to do that, because I don't know how that's going to happen.
Agreed.
But what you can do is you can start to create grades, and we've been trying to work with this, and I'm going to say trying because I don't want to give anybody any false assumption that we have answers either all the way through. But what you can start to do is start to think about a couple of different questions you want to ask yourself. And I do highly recommend going into Guskey's books, which is, what are the things that demonstrate growth? What are the things that demonstrate mastery? What will help students increase their movement towards the long-term thinking in the discipline, as we call these types of things being ways of knowing. We will use terms like transfer goals, which are the skills. And how do these grades connect to feedback? So in other words, if a kid gets an 80, right, and we still use 80, right, as what they got a B, then they should know what a B is and what they need to do to get an A instead of, well, do more homework or do this. The other thing by teasing this out, which is really important, is during an age where we have heightened anxiety levels of students. A student who has straight A's is at the top of their class, but every day goes and sits in the corner and cries because they're so overwhelmed, is not a success story. They are a failure of the system. And there has to be ways to pull those types of things out, where a kid who has, is not working with peers, a kid who's, those things should also be reported so that you can start to get those kids the right type of help to make them successful when they leave the type of structures that are rewarded in high school.
And so, to that point, how do we minimize that disconnection, right? Chris references the kid that gets all A's, but is emotionally fractured from the system that we encourage and celebrate. How do we help that youngster find value in what they're learning and how it translates into their future successes? Is really closing the gap and the disconnect between what we value as an institution and organization and what we report, right? And so this is kind of came from the encouragement of Dr. Guskey as we started working with him as a district, as we've read his literature, his research, things like that, which is first start by identifying what is important. And Chris referenced this 2 slides ago, is what we measure is what we value. So what do we value? And I'll be honest, if you look around your district, even if you do some soul searching yourself, because I can admit if I did this, I wouldn't know the answer without collaborating with my colleagues. In our school district, what you see before you is probably, I don't remember exactly, but I'm going to make it up. It's pretty close, like version 9 of this paragraph. And the purpose of this paragraph was posed with one simple question. What do we believe in? Mm-hmm. If we're communicating information to our community about student learning, what's it supposed to communicate? And to the point Chris made before, when speaking with elementary parents, like what does an A in kindergarten math mean? Like, and how is it any different than a B? Right. And so after multiple iterations, lots of conversations, we came up with the philosophy of grading UC. And you see suggestions there of things that deviate from the data blender, which is we do want students to make progress towards academic goals, right? Like let's be honest, that is important. It's critical. It's why we're here. Kids need to learn things. But do they need to learn them for the purposes of satisfying us at the end of the unit and letting a teacher pat them on the top of the head, like, way to go, you told me everything I told you back that you needed to tell me? Or celebrating the fact that students made meaningful connections between what they've learned, their current life, and their future. Furthermore, how do we memorialize and report on the attributes that celebrate the ongoing learning process, which I referenced before? Attitude, effort, homework, collaboration, things that we know will serve a student far beyond their years in our school district, right? What do employers look for? Employers are looking for individuals who can collaborate, who can be part of a team, who can problem solve, who have mental flexibility, right? And so what we really struggled with in our district is, I think it's 4 years ago now, we identified through a community effort a portrait of a graduate.
Yeah.
And so we have this thing that is allegedly what our community believes in is critical. You may not know this, or you can check it out on our website, but none of the things on there are academic grades. Nobody said SAT scores. Nobody said GPA. Like, those aren't on there. Critical thinkers are, flexibility, being resilient, having life-ready skills. Like, those are the things. And so when we compare that thing that we allegedly believe in above all else, and then we look at our grade reporting, there's a disconnect. And so our first step was to start to communicate to our community, here's what we do believe in, here's the purpose of grading. And the next couple of steps, which admittedly take a lot of time because this is an incredible challenge of the status quo, which is, how do we communicate student learning progress, student attitudes towards learning in a way that A, satisfies the community, B, also meets the needs of students as they move on. Like, let's be honest, the reason people can say, but colleges want those letter grades, is because school districts allow colleges to want those letter grades, right? If every school district tomorrow said, no more grades, we're going to provide students mastery reports and we're going to share with them progress markers towards learning that celebrate the process over the product, or at least simultaneously with the product, guess what colleges would stop doing? They would stop allegedly requiring those letter grades. Now, that's never going to happen, but how do we make progress towards that? And that kind of problems identified at the bottom. Like, great, that sounds awesome, except I work in a school or a school district where nobody wants to talk about this. Yeah. Grades are what they are. And I would say you do have some limited flexibility within your classroom. You get to decide and describe what learning looks like. You get to decide what markers of success look like.
Yeah, so I want to build on that and kind of sum up backward. Why it's a good idea, why it's a good idea to start off and really think about what you value. And the reason for that is, if we think about the system of grading as being broken, we're thinking about it the wrong way. Right? It's working perfectly fine. It's working exactly the way it's designed. It's producing the exact results it is. It's just not the results we want, right? It's creating a series where kids really like the idea of learning right at the beginning. They have it kind of beaten out of them as time goes on. Kids learn how to game school. They get good at school. The kids who take the least amount of risks are your highest performers. Kids have a tendency to feel dislocated from the learning process, and parents start to game the system as much as they possibly can to create a way of getting the specific type of grade to buy the right type of college for their kids, right? This works perfectly fine, right? We have a whole system based on it. So in order to be able to really start to think about how you make this better, is to think about what you really want, and then to try to design the reporting system that gets you what you want.
So we got like 3 or 4 minutes left here, and we're not even close to done. Well, I guess in this presentation we are between news, but we just want to talk about one more thing kind of quickly, which is, it's really nice to get into the granular nuances of the classroom, which is really kind of what we tried to focus on here, because we knew that the attendees had the potential to be lots of certain, novice teachers, people entering the profession. And so you really get to control those pieces of your classroom. How do you provide students feedback? How do you encourage a positive and healthy attitude towards risk-taking and the learning process? How do you provide assessments that really meet students' needs and allow them to demonstrate their learning? And then how do you report that learning back to their parents in a way that is productive and purposeful, right? So, but from a district level, there are other measures you can take for some other folks in the audience who may want to talk about this, which is my 9th grade algebra class. I can control all that, but not my 9th grade algebra class sits in a trajectory of mathematical learning. And how does that philosophy connect on a broader scale? And so one of the other projects we've taken on, it comes from Jay's work with transfer goals, which are these long-term targets of learning. They're not specific to this unit or this class, but they transcend math, right? So I'll use a math example because I'm going to show a language arts example on the next slide here, which is, if I'm teaching kindergarten math and I'm introducing numbers to students and I want them to understand how numbers interact with one another, and I'm teaching fluency and I'm teaching mental flexibility with digits and all of that as we move towards single digit addition. there are skills that are important there that are the exact same skills that are important in AP calculus. So no, math is ahead of the game, right? Because math has the standards for mathematical practice, for quite a while now. And if you look at those things, they apply to kindergarten in the exact same way they apply to calculus. How do we teach students to be resilient and persevere through problem solving? How do we teach students to use tools to appropriately interact with numbers, right? A couple examples. But those are examples of really kind of starting the transfer goals. But once you have those things, they start to develop the framework for what instruction should look like and how we provide students with feedback. Because at the very end, how do you evaluate a transfer goal? How do you determine we've made progress in this area that transcends the curricular standards for any particular class? Students have the opportunity to demonstrate mastery in a novel, authentic situation. And Jay talks about that.
So let me show you, I'm gonna show you an example of that being developed by our English language arts teachers, K through 12. And this is what you'll see here, which is the 6 transfer goals. And you'll notice that apply knowledge of conventional, I can't read right now. Apply knowledge of conventional usage of language in order to increase power, opportunity, and voice is something that a teacher can understand and can be applied at a kindergarten level, can be applied at a 12th grade level, and kids can make progress towards that goal moving through each level of schooling. And not only that, a kid may be at different levels of that. And when you start to think about transfer goals, you start to think of it as a long journey and not a whole bunch of like little independent year-long benchmarks of like, oh, a kid didn't make it this far. They're on this long road where they might be at different places on that road, but they're constantly making progress towards where you want them to be. And as stated earlier, like we were more than happy to share any of these resources, share everything we're doing. You have the presentation too. You want to go over the last bit of the closing remarks, the most important stuff, and then.
Yeah. So my big closing remark here, I don't want us to get into reading these bullet points to you, but for me, the biggest piece would be pick something. I feel like we have very strong ideas about this. This is something we are passionate about, something we talk about a lot with our colleagues. But it's a lot. We've been working on this for the better part of 6 or 7 years as a team now. And we probably have 4 or 5 more years of work before we really see demonstrable progress towards a lot of this stuff across the board. So I would say if you're hearing something here and it sounds intriguing to you, you can absolutely call us or email us for more information, but grab something. Feedback. Make a commitment to, I'm going to provide better feedback in my classroom. And here's what that's going to look like, and commit to that. Or if you're the evaluator of a teacher, how are you going to shape your feedback to help that teacher become better at something? Maybe it's formative assessment, maybe it's communicating progress, but I would say commit to something, because all the way back to the beginning, why are we here? We're here to really help students develop a love of learning. We want them to feel successful, right? The worst thing we can do is intentionally or unintentionally, and I sure hope it's unintentionally when it happens, teach a student they're no good at school, right, or that they can never be successful, because nothing could be farther than truth. And at the same time, the end goal, recognizing and celebrating that the end goal is different for every kid, right? A lot of the grade conversation we have is about leading up to the transcript and colleges and things like that, but not every kid is on a 4-year college trajectory, and that is perfectly acceptable, leads to a very successful adult life. We have students that go right into the military, that go to a 2-year school, that go right into a vocational program, things like that. We need to help meet student needs and really help drive their interests in a way that is productive, positive, and reassuring.
So
last words, they're yours.
Last words are mine.
They're
fantastic. Yours. So before we turn over to any questions, and I'll stay on for however long anybody has any, but we have a QR code here. So if you have a QR code reader, that's how you can access all the resources. Remember, you can email us at any time, and this presentation is recorded. We love talking to people anywhere, and we take as many ideas as we try to give. We're really looking for, we really try very hard to see what we can do to make this district the best we possibly can. And we have a really great team around us that does that as well. So, and we're always looking for other people that we can chat about education with.